You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast. It's back, supposedly retired, but we were always intending to do these special episodes now and again, and this one's in association with the MACP as part of our new partnership with them. So this is session 100 and something. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm Jack Chew. Firstly, apologies for my sound quality on this podcast. Unsure what's happened. I managed to completely blow my mic. Thanks to Jim and Matt for sorting out the audio on my side, but I really am sorry for the sound quality on my side of it. But yeah, Neil, Ollie, and Helen's audio was pretty good. So we've just patched mine up, and so we're going to try and proceed with that. But yeah, apologies on that. I've been really looking forward to getting this out there. We've come up with an educational partnership with the MACP where we've mapped all of our Physio Matters content from the podcast and from Therapy Live events over the years. So thousands of hours of content that we have then put against the HEE roadmap, which will then be able to be documented as part of MACP's 14 fish system against CPD. So we can all start to sort of track and appropriately accredit MSK excellence, which is a really exciting thing that we're delighted to be involved in. And the true sense of community of practice is really emerging in MSK in the UK. And this really is a bit of a flagship moment between Physio Matters and MACP that haven't always seen eye to eye, as we'll talk through on this podcast, to come together and hopefully be an example to others as to how we can all collaborate around a unified version of clinical excellence that can be aspired to and accredited appropriately. So really cool to talk this through with Neil and Helen from the MACP. Kindly, Dr. Oliver Thompson, friend of the show, the Words Matters podcast host, came on as a guest host to this because it just didn't feel appropriate for me to be leading with all the questions. So instead, I hogged the mic as a guest instead. But we had a really interesting chat, and so thanks so much to Oliver for that, and to Neil and Helen for joining me on this. So we're putting this out across the Physio Matters feed, but it also will appear across on MACP as well. But really enjoyed chatting to them, and so I hope you enjoy this conversation with Neil Langridge, Helen Welsh, and Dr. Oliver Thompson.
This is weird. I've often joked that I'm not a very good guest on other people's podcasts. I'm probably a worst host on someone else's podcast. So welcome to Physio Matters. So I'm here with Neil, Helen, and Jack to talk about a new partnership, collaboration between the MACP and Physio Matters. And I've got a ton of questions to kind of dig into this new partnership. But before we dive in, do you guys want to introduce yourself? Why not get Jack out of the way?
Yeah, thank you. And really excited to talk about this. It's been a long time coming, and therefore to sort of celebrate it and talk about it publicly and to add some meat on the bones of the story is going to be fantastic. I'm Jack Chew. I'm a physiotherapist and a podcaster, a broadcaster, and a new media sort of commentator in many ways across the MSK space. Really passionate about raising standards and doing so through both my clinical interest in MSK rehabilitation, but then also through policy, education, and collaborating across the board with different organisations. I run a clinical practice in South Manchester, as well as then Physio Matters, which is a sort of media company in healthcare. I also founded MSK Reform, which is a non-profit think tank, which operates again in the MSK space.
Cool. Thank you. Helen.
I'm Helen Welsh. I'm a consultant physiotherapist leading an FCP service in Northern Ireland. I'm currently chair of the MACP, and I've known Jack now for quite a while in terms of involving him and starting to engage him within the direction that the MACP wants to travel. And again, I can only echo what Jack says. It's great to finally announce our collaboration and to discuss it with you, Oliver.
Great, thanks, Helen. And Neil.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Neil Langridge. I'm currently working at a Health Sciences University, AECC University College. I'm the Director for Clinical and Rehabilitation Services. As previously consultant physiotherapist for 10 years within the NHS, and one of the current vice chairs of the MACP, and I lead on the Education and Approval Committee. And once again, I'm delighted. I have a long association with Physio Matters and a lot of Jack's work, and I'm always really pleased to be able to collaborate across some of the new models of work that continue to come out of that team. So yeah, really happy to be here.
Cool, great, thanks, Neil. And I'm Ollie Thompson, and I'm here in I suppose a capacity as my host of the Words Matter podcast, but I'm an osteopath and I work as an academic at the University College of Osteopathy. So maybe we start by, I suppose, just describing, perhaps each of you, one of you, the nature of this relationship, this collaboration, and we'll explore some of the historic events that either led up to it or perhaps didn't prevent a previous collaboration. But who wants to just set the scene about describing what this collaboration is all about?
Neil would be really well placed there, if that's all right.
Neil.
Yeah, sure. So this stems right back to some of the work that I was part of in developing a standard of practice for first contact, which is now published as a roadmap, which essentially takes an individual through primary care first contact practice into advanced practice. And those standards are inherently based on the IFOM standards, which are the International Federation of Manipulative Physiotherapy. That's an international group that the MACP sits under. These are international standards that are graded at level 7, so master's level standards, and there are a set of competencies that any MACP member has to attain through theoretical and advanced assessed clinical practice and clinical skills. So these were a set of standards that were agreed and published by Health Education England. And we then started to develop ways in which we could try to support individuals working their way through these set of competencies and capabilities. So what we did within the MACP, we looked at some of the courses that we offer and asked the tutors and the deliverers of those courses, can you map your courses to these competencies, so when someone attends your course, they'll have it's purposeful. They can link it to a standardized, recognized, validated framework. So we started to build that up, and I had a good working relationship with Physio Matters team and recognized they have a huge range of educational material, fantastic tutors, internationally known, highly evidence-based, critically reviewed, critical thinking applied. And so I thought, well, rather than trying to develop our own within the MACP any further, let's reach out to see what's already out there. Can we start to collaborate and bring this amazing set of educational resources as part of the way that individuals can map their own learning towards some of these standards? And so that's how it came about. I reached out to Jack and we started talking about it. I said, well, if you can map your work against these standards and engage a lot of your team into this, because it's a huge piece of work, we'd be delighted to see if we could take this further.
And maybe, Jack, to what extent, was it just by luck that the Physio Matters kind of content maps to or is congruent with the ACP roadmap? Is it just by sheer coincidence, or has there been a kind of some forethought about you generating kind of course content to map to that? Or will there be a shift? I mean, is it now the case that you're going to look through your directory and think, God, that doesn't map, we better delete that course and plug in something else?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I've thought about that quite a bit, because there's three parts to it. One, at least, is that I think it's congruent because the values underneath what we're all aspiring to are so similar, right? We're aspiring to best practice, but also trying to recognize where is that competency bar that we want to try and make sure, right? What we hope there isn't a ceiling, but we're chasing the ceiling, like what can be excellence, but then also recognizing, right, what's the floor? What commonality do we need to have? What confidence do we need to have in our peers here for when Joe and Josephine blogs present to MSK, regardless of sector or professional. So that's why I think that's where it's definitely not thoughtful and purposeful. Then there's the second piece, which is that we all just follow each other's work, right? So we've been then almost exploring that similar thing in such a way that then as as is mine and the team's job to pay attention, we've been persuaded by and hopefully been persuasive across the board. So you're going to have that natural mixing, even though you're not directly collaborating. Although with both Helen and Neil, as well as other MACP colleagues who've contributed to that work. So we share tutors. They've been on the podcast. Neil, famously, I'll make him blush now, but the most popular Physio Matters episode of all time is with Neil Langridge. And so therefore, it's ridiculous to think that they've been completely parallel tracks. And then the third thing is that the roadmap that Neil describes, as well as as that was building, we kept in touch and I was paying close attention and very keen at that point in policy. MSK, I was starting big R's before that, was starting paying attention to what that looks like in a governance sense, means that then we did, as we were developing things like Therapy Live, we were going to have advanced practice tracks. We were going to be recognizing that safety related, triage related, what is going to be compressing practice into smaller windows for first contact. Therefore, what are the key things that people need to know? What is the emerging, even litigation evidence around things like coronary recliner? So that's the more purposeful stuff, right? We definitely did then subconsciously still, but we were almost mapping content and creating content for that effect. So it became still a fair task because there's a lot of material we've produced, but it became then noticeably similar and wasn't overtly having to put a square peg in a round hole.
Helen, you're thinking about that congruency. Is there what kind of struck you, I suppose, about the kind of natural collaboration between the two organisations?
I think kind of the recognition of and the drive that we need to have an MSK standard that flows across healthcare professionals. And that's what the roadmap to practice is and has been adapted for. And as part of that scoping period, they looked at recognised standards that were there worldwide. And IFONT was highlighted as a standard that could be used and adapted for the UK healthcare population to use. And the fact that it's been seen as a foundational subset of both the roadmap to practice and it will be a foundational subset of the MSK AP educational standards. It's a natural evolution for kind of educational content providers and HEI courses and short courses providers to start to map, because as clinicians, we're looking to have some governance and some accreditation of our education, and mapping to a standard provides almost that educational reassurance that there's value in what we're doing. And we saw Physio Matters and the value and the content they provided as an automatic, obvious partner to approach in terms of widening that educational provision. And then there was an also move within the MACP. We've traditionally been focused on higher education routes to membership. We have had portfolio routes in the past, and we wanted really to re-establish our standard and our accelerated portfolio routes, recognising that wealth of experiential learning and the provision of quality and short course provision that people have. And finding a way of recognising that people can bring evidence in multiple formats and multiple ways that we can accredit and recognise and have as a route to our membership, but also wider to validate advanced practice and consultant level practice.
So just for me, so currently you can, as an MACP member, you go to the kind of car boot sale of CPD courses and just pick off the courses which meet the standard which you need to satisfy for registration. And so now we've got it all under one roof with Physio Matters.
Yeah.
There's a discount essentially where members will be encouraged financially and from a sense of quality to engage with the Physio Matters kind of courses Is that right? So apart from convenience, there's an economic.
There is, and it depends on what you want to use the courses for, and the fact that we have all signed up to an overarching standard means you can use a course for a variety of purposes. So you can use a course that's mapped against the standards either to submit as part of your FCP portfolio, submit as part of an advanced practice portfolio, or it can be cross-referenced, so you can link it towards a portfolio of experiential learning to MACP membership. Okay. So that's really the currency, that having that link standard across MSK educational provision provides that flexibility of learning and for learners to use their education as a currency for multiple developmental routes.
And just so, Jack, how will this collaboration change the content or see the kind of natures and the courses and content you have? Or is it just the case it's just going to be the same because it was congruent? Or are you now thinking actually there's opportunities to kind of digress into different topics? Or actually, like I said, is it the case that there's content, I don't know this, but there's content which falls outside, for example, the values or the standards of the MACP?
Yeah, I think that there's two extremes, let's say, and I'll say where I fit in the middle of that. One would be that this partnership is so persuasive and so alluring in such a way that then we shape everything we touch and do according to it, and therefore that would be, to my audience, an accusation, and fair accusation, of selling out, right? It just completely corrupts what we've done that's different, that's then led to this, and then it just completely then end up being overly almost tidied and shaped by a congruence to this document and other things. That would be one extreme. The other extreme being that we would be like, we won't change for no one. It's that we're going to then suddenly go left field. We're going to take a complete right turn and produce content to this effect, and let's see if the MACP tell us not to. I mean, so I'm describing compliance and petulance, and of course I'm being cartoonish there because it's somewhere that we know, and this is why it took some time and we were careful, is that the spirit of collaboration in this instance is one of which both organisations are trusting where each other are in such a way that the MACP are saying, we're backing the processes of which Physio Matters have gone through, in which then they are going to produce content and do their thing in such a way that then we don't need to agree with every single little last thing of it, but it means that if they continue to map what is appropriate across to our both values as well as then the roadmap, means that then our members and aspiring members and the people that we hopefully then persuade to become affiliates, consider a portfolio, etc., and then comply within that system of which historically we've critiqued, we're then moving them through in such a way that then it makes it easier for everyone. They're not feeling like everything's just separated or that they have to pick a tribe or pick a team. It's not that, well, I really like these podcasts and events and stuff, but it's such a shame how separate it is to when I want to almost formalize my accreditation journey now that I'm incentivized to do so. It's like, it isn't fair on them that they have to either pick one of those, or if they want to do both, that then is a massive difficult paper exercise. It's like both organizations should have made that easier for that person, because who is that person? That person is someone that is wanting to do their very best for their patients, wanting to further their education and understand better, aspire better to the evidence. What on earth are either of the organizations for, if not to make life better for that person so that they can help more people? I just find it, it just, now that we've done it, it's almost like, well, yeah, of course. And so that I hope answers the question. We won't be changing anything, but also we won't be so silly as to not truly be informed by what the MACP as an organisation, its members, and this wider community of practice informs us to, because that's always how we've created content. We have a massive feedback mechanism and a massively distributed leadership, really.
Neil, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to add in that that for folk that are utilising this partnership and gaining the knowledge and the information that Jack's team produce, the key to it is what you actually then do with that information. So Jack's team have mapped it, which gives you a guidance. The key to what you then do with it, it's the critical evaluation and the triangulation of critical review of that podcasts or educational material. So although we are guiding people, and there's a parallel to that, the step in for those individuals is to what you then do with that information. So it's not a passive recipient, it's actually that critical reflection of that podcast and what you then do with it and your application into practice, and how it then informs your current knowledge, how it challenges your current knowledge, and what it might do for your prospective clinical career. So I just wanted to make that really clear, that just because you would listen to a podcast, that doesn't mean that's your competency signed off. It's hugely informing, but it's what you then do with that information.
And there's no, have you guys thought about the risk of CPD becoming formulaic? So now there's a kind of, there's a lack of variation or diversity within the marketplace. It all kind of looks a bit like Physio Matters. It's blue. It's all blue coloured. And there's a kind of sense of it's all the same brand, and there's only Pepsi from now on. There's nothing else. Is there any risk that some of the smaller kind of providers, educators miss out? I mean, I suppose they would then jump ship onto Physio Matters, but that may not be practical or feasible. What have you given that any thought?
Well, yeah, and I definitely want to get Helen's thoughts on this, because she's informed mine quite a lot really on this, because I will admit that when we were talking about this, and I knew the work that was going to be involved, and I also knew the challenges of how we were going to need to try and move both audiences to comprehend this partnership, meant that I was like, well, this ain't worth it if it isn't for exclusivity. And that wasn't just a commercial reason, that was just as a means of protection and safety, because it was something that, but then, and this is where I say I invite Helen on this, and other colleagues of hers then in the MACP quite rightly then said that the spirit of what we're trying to achieve is far more appropriate to make sure that then this sets a precedent for others to then be able to marry it up, regardless of size. It amuses me that we're a big player now. It just kind of tickles me, but I do understand why that might be. And in both size and scale of content and what we do now is we do reach into various different places. So it definitely needs to be that we don't pull that ladder up. So we've set up a system in which then there is an educational partnership that people could then, if they are content producers and they want to then go through that process, there is a process that's been created by the MACP very sensibly to do that equitably and fairly, in such a way that then we wouldn't be prioritised. We would be one of a suite of options. And also, the reason that is something that is absolutely the right thing to do, and made me realise it very quickly, was because that is the spirit of what Physio Matters has tried to be. It is as broad a church as it can be. It's nothing is held sacred. Everything is scrutinised, but not in a sort of nihilistic scepticism for sake of scepticism's point. It's always been like, does that stand interrogation through various different logic models? How does that inform your clinical reasoning rather than dictate a new route forward? How do we not try and delineate by modality or style of practice in such a way that then we've got camps again? We've been trying to level that forever. So it would be hypocritical for us to then imply that we need to be the only show in town and everything needs to be blue, as you describe it, which I think is fair. So that both structurally, again, through Helen's leadership there, as well as the right decision, plus the fact that then culturally it would take for us to do a U-turn on our values and be called on it publicly, no doubt, if we were to then try to put walls up. It'd be farcical. So I hope that goes somewhere, and then we should be measured against that. I'm saying this and I mean it, and that then the market will help us to make sure we live by those values.
Helen, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I would kind of echo what Jack has said. Historically, we've worked with a range of educational providers in terms of our HEI courses, and each of those individual courses has a distinct flavour and a distinct approach, but they all map against an educational standard. And each of the course leaders would argue very much about the difference that you might get on each of those courses, but your overall outcome of educational quality is the same. When we first had this discussion, we wanted to make sure that the educational provider, or the preferred educational provider, had status that you had to attain. And it's quite a rigorous status. You know, Jack and his team have gone through a considerable amount of work to map the range of courses against the standard that we have helped and provided some governance oversight and worked in collaboration with the team to do that. And that is not a small task that Jack and his team has undertaken, and all credit to Physio Matters that they have done that. And that really gives us confidence as an organisation that we are more than happy to recommend those courses to our members and to the wider MSK community, that they map against our standards because they've gone through that rigorous governance process. And that's the same governance process that we apply to any of our HEI courses that look to join us as member. So it's not a small task, but it's not an exclusive task. And Jack's team has sent a benchmark for other people to get and to approach. And we're willing to work with any organisation that is happy to reach that educational gold standard mark. And we'll be supportive of that process to do it. And I think there's room at the table for a number of educational providers to give that flavour, to give that variety, because we all know as adult learners, we don't all learn in the same way, and it shouldn't be a uniform approach to learning, but we should have a criteria that learning is designed to achieve. And if you actually have a look at the standards in their totality, there's a lot of variation and flexibility in those standards, looking at research, looking at leadership, looking at management, looking at clinical reasoning, looking at critical analysis, as well as looking at a practical skill acquisition. So there's plenty of breadth and depth for courses to be developed that will have aspects that will link to the educational standards, but may not map in their totality to give that flexibility.
Early doors, me and Neil as well, we years ago were talking about the fact that then some of the rigidity, most of my early doors critique on the MACP was that there wasn't that breadth of access or variety, or that it wasn't necessarily contemporary both in its form and its content, in such a way that then it would be a massive mistake that I think we would spot if we were to then make that mistake again just with new media. And I think that thing that sort of inspired this whole thing, and the things that the journey that me and Neil have been on in sort of initially butting heads, but realizing there's such a similar thing was motivating us on that is to counter exactly what you're describing, I think, Ollie, because you've absolutely nailed it. And that's almost motivates a lot of it.
And when you were going through this mapping process, did you notice that there were areas which were particularly strong in terms of the complement of courses that you offer, and areas which you kind of just about met the standard, but actually was weak? And was there a kind of gravitation towards the typical MSK subject, which people have a pretty big appetite for?
Yeah, I think we were fortunate that especially with the advent of Therapy Live, we have been pretty prolific in recent years. You know, if we do this, all that we're describing would have applied well a couple of years ago, but then there would have been overt gaps, I think, especially with regards to, say, to leadership, systems management, that sort of stuff would have been definitely lacking on, as well as educational theory. I think we would have been lacking on. Fortunately, in recent years, we've done more work in that direction, partly because we've done just a lot more content as we've all been locked in as homes, and we were well placed to create multimedia content as the company we are. And the area that I think probably is a bit lighter for me is on some of the specific detail on things like imaging requisition, blood work, those sorts of really quite specific advanced practice skills, where those things have come up within, say, podcasts and webinars about a body part or area, but have not necessarily been then zoomed in on in terms of what does that look like on a governance and responsibility level? What are you doing with that information? How is that truly informing your clinical reasoning as a test or modality? And I think that that's an area where we want to take it off, the pressure off the learner to have to go finding those 5 minutes in each piece, and there is some content to be produced there. That's an area that is this thinner on the ground on the library, and so we did notice that, absolutely, and it was a very useful exercise for us to go through to notice those gaps. But it's similarly, you've got this opportunity where, as on our Physio Matters library, we've run sort of quite what seemed narrow business shows, right, for private practitioners that need to understand things like sales and marketing, or understanding what is an ethical approach to promotion of healthcare in this country, relevant to our wider governance in a rather public-led system, and rightly so. It was interesting for us to then look at that against the roadmap and think that this might be stuff we just need to chalk up as not. But the way in which that can inform leadership skill, and the way in which that can help people to truly comprehend their role and value and their position in society and stuff, it was really nice for us to realise that that also had its place, and that the MACP, the roadmap, even wider IFOMP standards, recognised that breadth and further reminded us as to why this was a good match. It was kind of like there were definitely areas we thought that was like, well, if anything, we probably thought we could, let's not bring that to the spreadsheet. We thought we might be able to have a bit of time off. And instead, it did map across, not to everything, but to something.
And I want to touch on, not dwell on, but just touch on why historically maybe you thought it wasn't a good match, and why the match didn't take place sooner. And perhaps, Neil, you want to talk about some of the perceived differences between the MACP and Physio Matters, or some of the differences in values, or kind of why now? Why has this happened now?
Yeah, I do think that actually the values are aligned. Jack mentioned that earlier. I think the values have always been aligned. I think what we've had historically with the MACP is a natural hierarchy, and if we're pre sort of podcasts and internet and access to information, it was driven by individuals offering their knowledge in what you have to admit is a quite guru-led model. So a singular person offering a philosophy, and their interpretation becomes yours. And I think that drove a very narrow model to expertise and excellence, which you sat on the top of a tree or top of a hill. And I think what happened then is, certainly from it's just my personal observations, is that as you saw a growth in knowledge at every stage, from student day one right up to advanced practice, that they've got the range of knowledge available to them, and it's actually being delivered directly in multiple ways. As Helen said, we learn in so many different ways. We were driving very fast, rapidly evolving reflective practitioners at much earlier stages in their careers than when I qualified. And what that did, in my opinion, is that challenged these hierarchies just by natural selection. It wasn't by design. I don't think it was by any sort of grand plan. There was this natural tension. And so the MACP in itself, in its entirety of how its persona would have, we had to look at that and say, well, actually, our model is about critical thinking and clinical reasoning and evaluation. What we need to do, we now to encompass and encourage, this is happening all around us, not just within the organization. And we've got to change the way that people see us, in that this is about technical skills. This is about knowledge and reasoning and the development of reflective practice and critical review. And so the clashes happen. I just think it was I wouldn't even describe it as clashes. It's actually a coming together and a discussion where you're seeing different points of view. And it was then, as we realized that there were some really common values and common aims and goals, that parallels started to just naturally come about. But I just think you've just got an historical emergence of the way that knowledge was translated from one very long process of individuals leading a philosophical approach to care, to the evidence-based model that was shared far more broadly and widely.
I concur that, and I think as well, it's sorry, I'm jumping straight in, but it was super institutional to me. Like that was the thing that I just couldn't get my head around. Now, not a lot of people know this of my background, but I had no problem with the MACP, but I also had more insight than a typical graduate. I was always MSK centric, even as a student, very interested in that. And so I then qualified into it, aspiring to get on that treadmill and turn it up as fast as I can and just get ahead in MSK practice in my 20s. And I graduated from University of Nottingham, and I volunteered over and over again. Now, it sometimes baffled my peers and my educators as to why I was like this, because you didn't usually have me throwing my hand up to be not in the pub and instead doing extracurricular, but I would volunteer constantly to be a model in the master's exams. I was always there. And the reason I was there is what is that next step? What is it? So what am I graduating into as an undergrad? And then what does that look like? And at the University of Nottingham, that is a sort of famous legacy MACP course, and taught by the lecturers of which I know and love. But what I then couldn't comprehend is that then that next step looked actually more formulaic than the reasoning model of which I was being set out on the world to. It wasn't meaning to, I didn't think, but it was just that then the acquisition of skill, particularly manipulative skill, that was more particular with its handling, that wasn't necessarily, the aspiration was you needed to just, pass these tests. I then came out and became an educator myself and started to use broadcast media as it was emerging to start asking questions of that model. It felt like a more natural tension that that history that I admittedly didn't revere as much as some would have liked me to, and that, not everyone, but some felt put out that I would, who are you to question that? Whereas that's just more as a temperamental thing. The last worst thing you can say really is that to me is to imply that I need to behave a certain way because it's always been that way. It was an expectation from some to doff a cap until you understand it, young man, and that were never going to wash. Especially because I was leading everything with a question mark, and so it was like there were what I felt were explicit claims being made for the MACP that this is what you do to aspire to excellence and then accredit excellence in this way. And I found that way to be too narrow. That felt like a walled garden. It felt exclusive, and it felt like part of what was motivating people to aspire in that way and to accredit in that way was to be part of that walled garden and to be a bit aloof. Now, I was, admittedly, I perceived that more than was actual. That partly what fueled me and the team at the time. I'm not going to pretend that wasn't some of what fueled our identity as a counter-revolution to some degree, and that the MACP was just purely symbolically something that we probably were the antithesis of. And it wasn't necessarily as fair as when I look back over it. I understand how it happened, and it was never anything personal, but it was more that this is the legacy institution of which then uses HEI as education, and you accredit yourself against these master's modules, of which you're paid for and are tested. And I just did not see that, especially with regards to them being manual therapy derived and them being about where you poke and press, as well as then when they did bring in, say, movement-based skill, it was always very formulaic. So if you learnt about movement theory on those courses, and again, I was a model in those exams, you would be measured against Shirley-Salmon criteria. Everything needed to be within its box, right? And that I did feel we were producing things that were so different. We were saying that all you need to be doing, we are all benefiting from anyone in their spare time thinking in this direction, which is what CPD was increasingly. Budgets were being cut on people being paid for by their trusts and service providers. So we were getting people listening in their commute to our podcast, and I just felt such an affinity to the audience in thinking like, good on you, you're driving to work, you should be listening to the radio, and instead you're thinking, how can I be better at treating these? And I just thought, unless the MACP could come up with a reason as to why that was the model, not a model, then I was always going to poke at that. And I think that's where some of that tension came from, and has in time dissolved, because we stopped needing that confrontation to define our character, but also I feel I watched the MACP I don't know, I'm not saying been persuaded by us, but the passage of time meant that then they came to terms with other modalities.
I would echo that. I think clinical reasoning and critical thinking has always been implicit in the core values of the MACP, but we haven't been explicit in that message. And we've been through a little bit of a reflective journey about ourselves and how we are portrayed as an organisation within the healthcare community. And we've been self-critical of that. And we have made a decision to be very proactive in terms of really looking at and redefining our vision. So, our vision is to help unify excellence in musculoskeletal health. And how can we do that if we don't engage with other healthcare professionals? And at the heart of the exec strategy is to try and grow and complement and support that development of that community of health in its wider sense. So really in our last strategy review, we reflected and we decided that we needed to do more work to really align our work streams to this vision and this mission that we've all signed up to. And that's some of why we've reached out to Jack and engaged with Jack in Physio Matters. It's why we're, developing that 14 fish portfolio, which will be open to, multiple healthcare users to utilize. And that's why we are in the process of consulting our membership about opening up our membership categories to non-physiotherapists. So that's been kind of a self-reflective and a strategic work stream that we've done over the last kind of 3 years, but that's been building on a momentum of sea change that's been coming probably over the last 5 to 10, where we've critically looked at ourselves as an organization and seen where we need to go in order to live to that mission and vision that we want to become.
And we're happy there's no existing tensions. I mean, given the primacy that kind of manual therapy skills has within the MACP, and how manual therapy is kind of presented and conceptualized and discussed within Physio Matters. I mean, there's no continued kind of arm wrestling about how to discuss. And I'm just picking manual therapy because it's common intervention, et cetera, but Jack, you're comfortable with how the MACP present and discuss manual therapy. Likewise with you, Neil, you're happy with how it's taught through Physio Matters. And so if Jack has a CPD video podcast which completely bags manual therapy based on kind of evidence, philosophy, that it might be congruent with the standard of critical thinking within the MACP, but possibly not skill acquisition around manual therapy. So how do you solve some of those, or are there existing tensions?
It's a really good question. I think you're right. When you look at some of the standards that we're working toward, these are knowledge, skills, and attributes. We spend a lot of time associating some of the MACP with some of those technical skills. Would I ever be happy? I don't think I'm ever going to be happy with a description of manual therapy, or that's something to keep aspiring to, because I can only say I did my MACP training in 1999. My experience is it's changed dramatically, in not necessarily my skill, my application, or however you would have described the hands-on treatment, but actually my thinking and my awareness of what actually is the reality of what I'm doing has changed a lot, and that should continue to do so. So we should never probably be happy and comfortable about that, because that would assume that we've nailed it. And I think manual therapy isn't isolated in that. Have we nailed exercise? Have we nailed communicate? We haven't nailed any of that. We continue to improve it all the time. And one of the benefits of having the way that Jack's team has developed education is that we force that critical assessment, and we do poke those questions, and that's how we continue to develop. So I'd be surprised if Jack disagrees with me that we ever want to be the point where we've got that wrapped up, we'll put that to one side.
No, I would certainly agree. I think one of the things that's, I'm glad I mentioned it before because it looked contrived now, but I remind you all, and I remind anyone listening in that thinks that Physio Matters has had some sort of bee in their bonnet about being hands-off. I remind them that our most popular podcast was with Neil Langridge, reconceptualising and describing and challenging a model of manual therapy, of which we're then, that was a very agreeable conversation in the main, because we were even back then we were all saying that the mechanism of effect remains something that matters far less and is less mechanical and less specific than we once thought, and that the evidence was playing that out, as well as the practice-based examples were playing that out. But then it was that we also need to recognise and respect the professions of which then can lay hands in a somewhat medicalised touch manner, we need to make sure we don't go too far the other way, and that there is a pendulum that can swing too far, and we all know what that looks like, and that's been what Physio Matters has said. Now, I think that there has been then, and I understand where it comes from, although I do think, admittedly, it is a bit of clumsiness and inattention, and sometimes chips on some people's shoulder to lump us in too much, as if we've been bastions of a very hands-on off narrative. And a lot of that is guilt by association. And also, I'm not going to sit here suddenly then slandering friends and colleagues of mine that do have more strident views against manual therapy than, say, me and my team do. But we rarely, if ever, produce content that was especially controversial in that direction. But we have platformed people like Derek Griffin or Adam Meekins, etc., because we are a platform of which then really does cover a breadth of views. But similarly, we take criticism for doing that, but we also take criticism for then speaking to people who do aim for an element of do still hold out for an element of specificity, or the higher end skills that are harder to measure, or what have you, that come to certain elements of touch or manipulation. We do admittedly pride ourselves in hearing opposition from both of those camps, and we are a broadcasting journalistic platform and education provider that really does want to be a broad church, that feels that there are so few hard and fast answers out there that we should all be leading with open questions, and that whilst we don't open our minds so much that as brains fall out, we do recognise that we need to be humble about the mistakes that have been made before, where we thought we had answers when they weren't at all anywhere near where they needed to be, and that we all looked a bit silly. So let's have strong views, but loosely held. Let's recognise and respect the fact that then we come at things with a question, that me and mine can be issuing either narrow or broad apologies when we've been wrong, but that time passes, and that's science, that's medicine, that's philosophy. Like, we learn, we're persuaded. And to me, that's why I don't think there is an existing tension, because actually, you look back, a lot of that's been perceived on both parts rather than actual, and that now we're all recognising that this, on the same hymn sheet, it's not really, is it? It's a wider hymn book at the very least. It's a process that we can all comply with. That means that we don't have to agree on every little detail. Now, how boring would that be?
I mean, you say it was perceived, but I'm only imagining an MACP assessment of hands-on skills. There'd be very actual competencies about handling and specificity and being able to recall mechanisms. So I don't know if I don't.
Competence is key there, though, isn't it? Right. That's an area of maturity as well over at Physio Matters as an organisation, is realising the practicality of the fact that originally we did have a bit of a. Everyone needed to be aspiring to be super contemporary. It was designed to reduce the evidence to practice gap that we were told about, right? That's what the podcast was doing. So we were often trying to set the bar freakishly high. Now, we've matured into realising that on a policy level, you create competence. So now I wouldn't have a problem with the fact that then you're scrutinising those mechanisms, but it's more that the MACP, in my opinion, has recognised that it can't then be, it hasn't got the evidence or argument to imply that that's what excellence looks like. So instead, I feel that they've not dropped their standards bar, but we've come to realise that for creating competency, that's where we need to be open about the whole breadth of the evidence and understanding as to the mechanisms. I think that's what it is. And sorry to have interrupted, but that competency word I think is crucial there. And my arguments that still remain is that it's when you imply that instead of competent handling, that is such expert handling that you're then going to get results because you have made more meaningful changes, let's just say narrowly to the tissues, or that you've interacted with that person's nervous system in such a specific way with your hands that is what is preceding your good result. Don't think that's defensible. Hold that opinion, feel free to. But I'm just meaning that if then the MACP was to, what I felt it was historically, overindulge that line, then yeah, this collaboration wouldn't be happening. But instead, I see the MACP meaning that hold those views, meet that competence, but fundamentally the organisation isn't saying that is the route. We need to look closer and closer to that. They, for me, have broadened their horizons. They're looking through more filters. They've got that fisheye lens on, looking at the bigger picture. How can we create competent clinicians and grow this impact that we can have on the population?
So maybe finishing up, we look to the future. So Helen, you can allude to the potential to open up MACP to non-physiotherapists. And if we can potentially tie that into future collaborations with Physio Matters from beyond physiotherapy, who wants to paint us a picture of what's coming up?
Well, probably me and Neil can have. We looked, I think it was about 3-4 years ago, we set up a new category of affiliate membership, and Jack was really helpful at that time, providing some thoughts and inputs into that affiliate membership category. So that was, again, starting to look at having a category for members, physiotherapists at that time, who had an interest in musculoskeletal management and wanted to join that wider community of health that would sit underneath the MACP umbrella. So that was kind of that first stage. And as I say, we've gone through that self-reflective strategic overview, which has led the executive committee now to reach out to our members to give them a proposal that we want to widen that affiliate membership to open it up to non-physiotherapists in terms of that wider community of health, and providing that forum to have that critical discussion and that debate, and to grow that body of evidence. So as it's not a static process, that evidence and application of knowledge becomes a dynamic, transformational process rather than a line in the sand. So we're in the process of scoping our memberships and driving quite hard for a membership vote for that to happen. And we're hopeful that our membership will vote on that kind of in September. And then that can go into our next stage in terms of where we go as an organisation kind of in the future. We're working with our partners with 14 Fish, and this is why Jack's courses are so valuable, because anybody using that portal to support their evidencing for an FCP sign-off then doesn't have to look through their evidence and think, right, what does this course already map to? Jack's team has provided that information. They go to the spreadsheet, they can retrospectively go through and cross-reference about their domains and capabilities. So we're really pulling all these strands together to make up a joined up approach, and using our partner organizations to help us realize, that vision that hopefully will continue long after I step down as chair in October, and the next exec takes over for me and drives it even further. I'll pass over to Neil at that point.
Yes, so for me, the future, this is absolutely is, as Helen says, this is about building that vision around a community of practice. My time within the MACP, I've had different experiences, and what I always been really excited about is that opening up and partnership working. the end of silos, the end of descriptors that actually put us into boxes in the way that we describe ourselves. I'm a X type of physio, or I'm associated with this type of philosophy. We've had far too much of that over a long period of time. And hence why I can see the vision of the MACP is to actually be part of leading that change. We're not asking to be the singular model, but what we are wanting to do is partner up. So most importantly, for the patient, the confusion around patient care and the application of treatment paradigms and philosophies is starting to wash away, that it is really about best evidence musculoskeletal healthcare and not about a philosophy or a guru-led approach. And so that sort of step into that space for me is why this is exciting, and exactly why I really enjoy being part of the current executive, and why that for me has given that opportunity to see actually, this is what makes being a clinician really exciting, because you are drawing from so many multiple perspectives and areas of practice that can only help you deliver your practice in a more informed way.
That sounds like a good place to end. Jack, do you want to add anything?
It was a good place to end. You sure you want me to spoil it? I would like to again reiterate the thanks to the MACP for working with us on this, because it would have been good of them anyway to say, we invite you to do this, but the way in which they've helped us to understand and comprehend their models and systems in such a way that then we could aspire to them, because I think that means that we all understand each other on that deeper level, and that there has been some sunk cost in a way that I think is going to stand as well. I would say as well, the timing is relevant. I think that as we all re-emerge as best we can from what has been, of course, a very disruptive time with the pandemic, but also where we've kind of realised that on a workforce level, there's various challenges. It naturally speaks to the fact that then why wouldn't we be wanting a big collaborative MSK workforce? But then the question becomes then, how do we measure each other's competence? How can we respect each other's histories, but whilst recognising that the things that unite us are far more important than would ever divide us, intra and interprofessionally, in such a way that then it just feels that the only way in which we can solve our version of the public health challenges that we face as a society, both of course, and as a country and internationally, is one of which we recognise where we can get as best bang for his buck, and to help people scale their function, understand their personal goals, and drive forward together. And that education is obviously crucial to that. Accessible education, being able to trust the processes that we all comply with, is one of the big breakthroughs that have made this happen. Is that the MACP have stood forward and said, look, what has been done with the HEE work is a true aspirational standard that we can all then comply with appropriately, so that can unify, because it's something that was so well done and well written that we know that encompasses as much as is appropriate and can be a live and moving, evolving thing too. That was no small thing. And I think that's really helped us, that had Physio Matters have come up with something, or had MACP have come up with something, and then we're all trying to then work out whether or not we want to comply, I think it would have been more of a challenge. But instead, that we've taken an opportunity on the timing to say, no, that is the best route forward. And that is a way in which we can all aspire to it. And therefore, I encourage everyone that might be interested in what Physio Matters has done to really look at and consider sensibly joining the MACP as an affiliate member, at the very least. I think it's 20 quid, is it, Helen?
It is at the minute, but it will go up because we're including 14 fish as part of that.
You're not going to sock it to me, and it's not going to be $1,000, is it? It's still going to be cheap. Is it? I'm about to try and sell it, but either way, it's been, really that, and the price point is just one point of accessibility, but it's more that it started the history being that you needed to be on a pathway to aspiring to, and always needing to sort of chase what was then to some a narrow sense of excellence. Now it's that any interested party in the UK, increasingly multi-professionally, or hopefully later in the year, joins the MACP And therefore, we can together work towards how we can raise standards in the industry and make us better at helping people with pain and injury in this country and beyond. I mean, what on earth is it all for if not that? But at the moment, we're too fractured, and that is really clumsy. And so I think that that's one of the things that excites me most, is that the whole point is for us to lay some foundations, demonstrate a true collaboration, and welcome other organizations and individuals to give it a chance, realize and try and cast off some of the biases and preconceptions, understand where, doesn't mean that this, welcome more questions to challenge that history, but generally speaking, why can't we work together?
Jack, Helen and Neil, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Oliver.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap. That's our announcement of our partnership with the MACP. Delighted to be doing that. Do go onto your MACP accounts and find out the discount codes if you're an MACP member already. If you're not, then please do consider joining the MACP. There are various different accessible memberships now, including an affiliate membership, which is where if you're an interested person in MSK, needs to be a physio now, but that is changing, as was mentioned in the podcast. But you can join for very little money. I think it's 20 quid, something like that you can join as an MACP member and start to then integrate into some of this plan that we're talking about, whereby we are now breaking down those boundaries and making it more options, more accessible options for us to drive forward and change things together. So please do have a look at them if you haven't for a while, and also visit physio-matters.com and email us info@physio-matters.com if you have any feedback on this, or get hold of us on socials. But yeah, thanks so much for listening, really appreciate it. And I haven't had a chance to say this for a while, so I'm going to go for it. You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters. Bye for now.